Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome back to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month here, we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th all the way to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of this Cineverse film discussion group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. Yep, we're still a few months away from Halloween, that's true, but that doesn't mean we have to wait around to feat a fantastic horror movie. So this month we'll be lighting birthday candles for one of the most spine-chilling flicks of them all, The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and celebrating a 40th anniversary this year. And I'm thrilled to announce that I rounded up, I think, the perfect guest for this installment. It's Kim Newman, a film critic and horror movie historian from the UK who remains one of the world's go-to experts on scary cinema. Kim and I are going to check into the Overlook Hotel and peer deep into its maze-like rooms and corridors as we attempt to learn why The Shining continues to frighten, why it's worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, and how it stood the test of time. For some needed background on The Shining, let's turn briefly, however, to Wikipedia. So here's the lowdown. The Shining is a 1980 psychological horror film produced and directed by the great Stanley Kubrick and co-written with novelist Diane Johnson. The film is based on Stephen King's 1977 novel of the same name, and the stars are Jack Nicholson, Shelley Duvall, Scatman Crothers, and a very young and impressive Danny Lloyd. The film's central character is, you know the name, it's Jack Torrance, played by Nicholson. He's an aspiring writer here and a recovering alcoholic who accepts a position as the off-season caretaker of the isolated historic Overlook Hotel in the Colorado Rockies. Wintering over with Jack are his wife, Wendy, portrayed by Duvall, and his young son, Danny, brilliantly acted by Lloyd. Danny possesses the Shining. This means psychic abilities that enable him to see into the hotel's horrific past. You've also got the hotel cook, that's Dick Halloran, personified by Scatman Crothers. He has this ability, the Shining, and he's able to communicate with Danny telepathically. The hotel had a previous winter caretaker who went insane and killed his family and himself. After a winter storm leaves the Torrances snowbound, Jack's sanity deteriorates due to the influence of the supernatural forces that inhabit the hotel, placing his wife and his son in danger. That's about as far as we'll get on the spoilers to this point, but in any event, it kind of wets your whistle, right? Production took place almost exclusively at EMI Elstree Studios in the United Kingdom, with sets based on real locations. Kubrick often worked with a small crew, which allowed him to do many takes, sometimes to the exhaustion of the actors and staff. You can learn more about this if you watch the Making of the Shining documentary on the DVD or Blu-ray. The new Steadicam mount was used in this film to shoot several scenes, giving the movie an innovative and immersive look and feel. You can definitely see its impact immediately when you watch Danny riding his tricycle throughout the hotel, for example. It's pretty innovative stuff for 1980. The Shining was released in the United States in limited markets on May 23, 1980, and then it enjoyed a wide release on June 13th of that same year. There were several versions created for theatrical releases, each of which was cut shorter than the one preceding it. Now, the original theatrical cut clocked in at 146 minutes, and I think that's only about 2 minutes longer than the version you get currently on home video. Reactions to the film at the time of its release were mixed. Stephen King in particular was not a fan. He criticized the film due to its deviations from the novel. But guess what? Critical opinion has become more favorable over time, and it is now widely regarded as one of the greatest and most influential films ever made, and it's become a staple of pop culture. In 2018, The Shining was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as being culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. Today, The Shining garners a not-too-shabby Rotten Tomatoes score of 85%, with an average critical score of 8.44 out of 10. Now, that's pretty good stuff for a horror movie. Oh, and by the way, a sequel, Dr. Sleep, was released just last year, November 8th, 2019. So, okay, normally I share audio from our Movie of the Month's original theatrical trailer at this point. Problem is, the stellar 1980 trailer for The Shining, it simply featured creepy music and the famous shot of the elevator filled with blood. while I highly recommend you go seek this out on YouTube and watch it for the exercise in minimalistic brilliance that it is, the original trailer doesn't quite paint a picture audio-wise. So instead, if your nerves can stand it, let's feast our ears on a re-release trailer for The Shining.
Red run. Red run. Red run. Red run.
The Torrances are going to take care of the Overlook for us this winter.
Red run. Red run.
I'm outlining a new writing project. 5 months of peace is just what I want.
Are you scared of this place?
No.
What about room 237?
It's typical of you to create a problem like this when I am really into my work.
Red run. Red run. Red run. Red run. Red run.
A little slow tonight, isn't it?
Oh yeah, like a thrilling coaster ride when you're 13 years old, no? Prior to introducing our guest, it's time for some cautionary boilerplate. So if you've only read the novel or you merely watched the hilarious spoof by The Simpsons called The Shining, or let's say you've somehow skipped over this 1980 movie and went straight to the Dr. Sleep sequel, not likely considering that film's relatively poor box office yield, or worst of all, you've never read or seen any of the aforementioned, put me on pause, please. Cue up the Kubrick original and pop culture yourself up by finally watching The Shining. Okay, still a few stragglers who haven't returned, I see, but we'll just have to go on without them. Now, I have to take a moment to gloat here. I've been seeing and hearing Kim Newman waxing poetically about all manner of genre films, particularly horror, sci-fi, and fantasy movies, for a couple of decades now, as he's often appeared as an interviewed expert on DVD and Blu-ray bonus features and commentaries. Kim's knowledge of cinema is, in a word, astounding, and I almost always end up agreeing with his critical assessments, his ratings, and his rankings of films, especially movies of the scary variety. Now, most recently, Kim provided impassioned arguments for why the movies Dead of Night and Night of the Demon, for example, are the minor masterpieces they are, and that's evidenced by his appearances on those two Blu-ray releases by Kino and Powerhouse Indicator, respectively. So it goes without saying that the horror fanboy in me is pinching himself right now that Mr. Newman has agreed to board the Cineversary train. So pardon me a moment while I do my little private celebratory dance, which thankfully you cannot see. Okay, all danced out. Now it's time to introduce my esteemed guest, Kim Newman. I want to welcome renowned author, film critic, and expert on horror movies, Kim Newman, from the UK, who I'm delighted to have as an expert to discuss all things Shining. So, Kim, welcome to Cineversary, and thanks for agreeing to be on our show.
Oh, well, happy to do it.
Fantastic. So, I have to ask you, where and when did you first see The Shining, and why is it important to you?
I first saw it, I think, the weekend it opened in 1980.
Wow.
That would have been in Britain, late summer. I know that in the afternoon I had seen Being there at the same cinema.
Amazing.
And it was a cinema in Kingston, not the one in Jamaica, but the one in the smallest town near London. I remember who I saw it with, my friend Dean. Let's see, I just graduated. I'd been 21. Obviously, Stanley Kubrick was a really important filmmaker growing up. I mean, that run from Dr. Strangelove, 2001, Clockwork Orange, Barry Lyndon, all that, yeah, I'd sort of built him up as a major figure and someone who we were all really interested in. Yeah, it was this a kind of a sense that this is a serious filmmaker. I don't think I'd read the novel, although I had read Stephen King. And I'd read Salem's Lot by then. I think I was a little tardy in in reading Stephen King. I had a sort of fairly typical teenage horror fan snobbery towards modern stuff. And spent my formative horror reading years on Anne Radcliffe and Melmoth the Wanderer. Although I did catch up, so I was aware of him as a creative as well. But I suppose thinking there had been, at that time, there'd been Rosemary's Baby and there'd been The Exorcist, but the notion of, as it were, a big studio A-picture horror film was still quite unusual.
Right.
Maybe The Omen was in there as well, although that's kind of a schlocky picture, isn't it? Before even Rosemary's Baby, I suppose The Innocents and The Haunting have it as well, where you take a reasonably contemporary best-selling horror novel and you get like A-list stars and an A-list director who's not necessarily associated with horror as a genre, and Silence of the Lambs also fitted into that later.
Absolutely, I would agree.
But it's not, and not actually until maybe It recently has revived that tradition. It's still not a particularly populated subgenre or subcategory of horror, is it? There are probably fewer than 25 films that fit into that description.
Yeah, the prestige horror movie, right?
Yeah, not all of which were hugely successful. I mean, after showing there was the film of Peter Straub's Ghost Story, which is really interesting, but was not a commercial success and didn't really work as an adaptation of outstanding material.
Right, and then of course you have Bram Stoker's Dracula, directed by Coppola, right?
That's right. You had that a little later, that little run. So there was a sort of sense of respectability, and the Minority Report on this, as it were, there is a sense that some horror fans now feel that these kind of movies don't really count. Yeah, they're a bit too respectable. Yeah, they're sort of like, I don't know, mainstream rock and roll or jazz or whatever.
Sellouts,
it's like,
right?
Yeah, you need compared to, say, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, or Night of the Living Dead or Halloween, which are small and scrappy and garage band horror.
Exactly.
Whereas The Shining literally is big band horror. That's the music that's in it. Henry Hall, who was sort of still vaguely, lingeringly famous in Britain because he'd been, I suppose, Glenn Miller would be the American equivalent, but he was this huge radio band leader of like my grandparents' generation. But we all still knew, and of course he'd done Teddy Bear's Picnic, which was a lasting children's hit record. So that it was probably, from Kubrick's point of view, just a random choice, but putting that on the soundtrack actually really meant something.
Wow.
Now, actually, you only ever hear Henry Hall on horror films, which is a very odd thing. It's as if you only ever heard of, I don't know, Lawrence Welk on horror films.
Sure. So it sounds like the movie made a big impression upon you, even though, well, of course, it was an event movie for you. You were waiting for the next Kubrick picture. But you walked out of the theater. What were you thinking?
It's a difficult film to process, actually, and it is a film, and this is true of almost all Kubrick films. It takes a couple of viewings to settle.
Sure. And
I felt the first time I saw it that the first half was a really terrific, slow-building, suspenseful, scary horror film. I mean, the sense that this might be the most terrifying film of all time, and then it turns into this sort of demented sitcom. I remember in my original review of it, in the first edition of Nightmare Movies, I said it was kind of like the episode of I Love Lucy where Desi finally snaps with the dizzy redhead and goes after her with a baseball bat.
Wow.
And I do think that there is an element of that. That is part of the way the film plays. It's a black comedy as much as it's a horror film, but all of Kubrick's films are actually essentially black comedy. That's his
true.
tone,
yeah.
And it's sort of silly to expect anything else.
So did that diminish the experience for you? Did it become too comedic in some way?
No, not. I mean, I still think it was a terrific picture. I'm not sure if it delivered what horror fans wanted at the time, and I'm not sure it delivered, as it were, what sort of mainstream movie. There was a sort of sense from the general critical reaction at the first there were some people who felt that horror cinema was beneath Stanley Kubrick, and there was maybe Stephen King is the major arguer of this, who felt that Kubrick had a superior attitude. That said, I think that, like some horror films made by people who come from outside the genre, it's actually far more committed to being frightening than many horror films made by genre insiders.
Interesting.
And it's frightening in an unusual way. It's got shocks and jumps and build-ups of suspense. But I think Kubrick is really interested in all kinds of stuff about cinema, the use of space, particularly the use of sound, the use of source music, the sort of the weird jarring things that maybe later you see in some of David Lynch's movies. It's a film that is disturbing, often in ways that go beneath rational thought. Again, it's one of the things that people tend to do with horror films that they shouldn't, is try and make sense of them. And I think sometimes the whole point of horror, I mean, there's a whole documentary about people who have weird theories about what The Shining means and how it puts together and what's actually going on in it. Yep. And I think that there is a case, because Kubrick is such or is perceived as such as a chilly aesthete as a director, there is a sense that maybe there is a kind of a hidden or arcane knowledge in the film that isn't necessarily there, but I think it's supposed to seem to be there. It is a film that keeps drawing back to puzzles and mazes and models and all these sort of intricate things. It's a kind of a big dollhouse of a movie, isn't it? And I think that's partly because it connects deeply with those elements of a traditional childhood we deem frightening. A year or so later, you have Poltergeist, which is a sort of similar story, but that's the much more approachable one, isn't it? That scary clown dolls and all these things. But
you still have the house being built on the Indian burial ground kind of trope there too,
that's
right?
But there's no sense in that what's scary may also be your dad. The family who squabble and bigger, they're all right. Whereas in The Shining, they're not.
No, that's a pretty terrifying concept.
The family have problems by the time they get to the Overlook. And I suppose it is a similar basic outline to the Amityville horror, which had come and gone, in that it is, dad is driven mad by a haunted house and tries to kill the family.
Yeah, so maybe a bit of an inspiration there.
I mean, because King has written about the Amityville horror. I'm not sure whether the novel of The Shining predates, the paperback account of the Amityville horror, the literary influences on Stephen King, and even because King is one of those people who draws influences from everywhere. On one hand, you can look at The Shining and see, there are elements there of Henry James or Shirley Jackson or the classic Gothic novel. But you also can think, there are also elements of all those TV movies of the early 70s in which, nice couples move into haunted houses. There's an early Steven Spielberg credit called Something Evil, which is very similar. Right. And I remember things like This House Possessed and The House That Wouldn't Die and Crowhaven Farm. All these kind of, a couple move into a haunted house or family move into a haunted house and get terrorized.
Right. The Amityville Horror, that was a really good kind of reference because I looked it up. It's published the same year as King's novel, so I don't know to what extent it influenced, but that's a good call.
I think that speaks more to zeitgeist than to specific influence.
Sure.
I think that there are sort of things going around. And actually one of the things that's unusual about The Shining is that it's set in a hotel. It's not set in a house.
That's right.
The Amityville horror is all about buying property. It's all about the family assuming ownership. Whereas what's kind of interesting about the Overlook Hotel is that it wants people to stay. It wants to own people rather than it wants people to own it. Knowing how novelists think, because I've done this as well, King may well have come up with that in looking at what's the usual way you get somebody into a haunted house, and let's do something else. The whole notion of being the caretaker, which becomes so important to it. it's one of those things, it's so distinctive, it's such an unusual plot point that you don't often see it repeated. The only other, and I know, one thing that I know was an influence on Stephen King, because he wrote an essay for a book I edited about it, is Burnt Offerings, which was originally a novel by Robert Marasco, but then became a film by Dan Curtis with Oliver Reed and Karen Black. And that overlaps a bit with The Shining. That's about a family who become caretakers to a house that swallows them.
Right.
And in fact, the business of the final manifestation of the swallowing being the addition of the doomed characters to photographs, that's in the film of Burnt Offerings. Before it's in the film of The Shining.
You trace some great predecessors that I'm sure even in the ether kind of inspired what was going on in this film.
Arthur C. Clarke said that when Kubrick set out to make 2001, it's like the first thing he did was he read lots of science fiction, and then he watched every science fiction film ever made. I wouldn't be surprised if he spent a chunk of the 1970s watching horror films. I know he saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre because he talked about that in terms of being impressed with things Tobe Hooper had done.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Absolutely. I want to ask you, why do you believe The Shining is worth celebrating 40 years on? How has it stood the test of time? And Kim, why do you think it still matters?
Well, I say it's a film I watch again every couple of years. I watched it again late last year. I think it still matters because it's still about something interesting. It's not a film that seems particularly dated, maybe because it's set in a remote place, so you don't have all the apparatus of computers and mobile phones and the internet and all that kind of stuff that it now seems to be the betokening of the past. And also because it's in a cold place, they're all wrapped up warm, so they're not wearing kind of like 1980s fashions. In fact, the rather down-at-heel look, because they're not particularly rich. And then the Overlook Hotel itself is a period building. And actually, I'm not sure, is it a 1970s film or a 1980s film? It came out in 1980, so it feels like a cusp of the decade.
I was thinking the same thing as I rewatched it the other night.
Yeah.
So just echoing what you said earlier, that like many Kubrick films, it rewards upon repeat viewings. That's thanks to it being so deeply layered, so likely symbolic, if you want to look at it that way, and open to interpretation. There's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty built into this picture, including the possible unreliability of Jack or Danny or Wendy as narrators, the mystery about the final shot featuring Jack as the caretaker in 1921, the implausible architecture of the hotel, and the physical layout that just kind of defies, architectural reason, if you will.
That's something that's in Hill House, isn't it? The thing is, in Hill House, it's pointed out in the dialogue. In The Shining, it's almost one of those things that you think you've spotted continuity errors, but maybe you haven't.
No, I definitely did. I mean, I watched Room 237. They point some of these things out. That's a maddening documentary, by the way. It's very frustrating to me because I don't tend to agree with more than maybe 25% of it. But they do correctly point out that, I mean, as much of a perfectionist as Kubrick is, it's hard for me to believe that there's such glaring continuity errors. A chair that's there one scene, and then when the cutaway and it comes back to Jack and the chair's not there. Or Danny's on the pattern of the rug. They cut away to what he's looking at. They cut back, and he's on a different pattern of the rug. I mean, I don't think these are accidents.
No, I don't either. I think it is disturbing, and it's suggestive of a haunted place. But I wonder if it's not influenced by looking at a lot of really cheap horror films where stuff like that happens because they filmed under difficult circumstances or rapidly or frankly, sometimes are not terribly talented.
Yeah, I think Kubrick's having fun with this, right? I mean, I think he's exploring those tropes and the limitations of a lower budget movie.
Yeah, for an expensive film, it's still quite small.
It's true. I mean, there's not a large cast here. It's just one location, pretty much, although a big one.
Yeah. I suppose technically the Discovery spacecraft is a small enclosed space. But 2001 is an enormously expansive epic. The fact that 2001 ends in a kind of haunted hotel room sort of does feed into The Shining in interesting ways.
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that also an answer to this question, The Shining, it defies or exceeds our expectations for what a horror film can or should be. So when released, it was one of the longest horror movies ever made, clocking in at about 2.5 hours.
As soon as The Shining started playing on television, they started playing the long version without probably even realizing what they were doing. And now, I know both versions are available. I prefer the longer one. I think there are things in it that I really miss in the shorter version, which is unusual. Usually I find as it were, the studio release cuts play better. I think the shorter version of The Wicker Man plays better than the longer version. But I don't think that's the case for The Shining. I always feel that it's a film I wouldn't mind being longer. I quite like being in that scary place.
Agreed.
This is the thing I think is the key difference between the novel and the film. Is the novel is basically Jack's story. It's from his point of view. The film is Danny's. And you spend time looking up from that tricycle, and there is that kind of childish wish to explore the labyrinth in every room and wander around. And I find that sometimes just the bits that I really like are the bits where he opens doors and you see scary things and then move on to the next stuff, or even just things like the endless riding around on the tricycle and the noise it makes on the carpets and then the polished wood floors. The rhythm of it is seductive. Even people who don't like it tend not to find it boring.
No, that's a good point.
Whereas I know people who don't like 2001 or Barry Lyndon find them boring. I think they're wrong, but you can't argue with people's subjective feelings about movies. Yeah, I'd be interested to have a sense of what people who come to The Shining now, after being used to the rhythms of filmmaking having changed a lot in 40 years.
Yeah, that's true. It seems like the average runtime of any movie, including a lot of horror movies, has certainly extended. They're longer today.
And now The Shining doesn't seem unusually long.
No, but for the day, I looked this up, Kim. This was technically, if the article I read was correct, the second longest horror film ever made, the first being Qui-Gon.
It's the longest English language. That's only true if you exclude Bollywood films. Okay. And actually a lot of Asian films tend to have different longer running times.
Yeah, as far as American horror films, though, no one had really seen something this sprawling.
Yeah, that's right. And it's still unusual. I mean, I believe currently the longest horror film is It Part 2, but there are things like in the last couple of years there's been The Road to Wellness. That was long, wasn't it? And so was the remake of Suspiria.
Yeah.
Is it The Conjuring Part 2 is 2.25 hours long?
Exactly. That's what we're getting at. These even horror movies are going on the longer side. I don't know if you can credit The Shining to that trend, but the point is, you had mentioned that maybe today viewers would be a little more patient with The Shining than they would have been in 1980. Is that what you were getting at? Yeah,
I think so, because of the idea that length now is not... And I still think that there is a case to be made that horror films work best, shorter length. But The Shining takes place over months. It's a deterioration story. It's an expansive story. It's not so much a shock roller coaster. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I think, takes place inside a day, doesn't it? It's a day and night. And
it's a raw,
stuff
visceral
like Halloween
experience.
or Night of the Living Dead. They all have really compressed time frames. The Shining doesn't, but also I think it is that feel that it relates to a particular kind of filmmaking that I associate with the 1970s. The Shining actually reminds me quite a lot of another Jack Nicholson, Scatman Crothers movie, King of Marvin Gardens, which has a sort of similar, slightly skewed feel to it. And that has a sense where the approach to filmmaking that was sort of cemented in stone by things like Jaws or Star Wars, where every single scene moves the story forward. It's people are always on the move. People are always in action. Stuff is always happening. People are always arguing. Whereas that is true in The Shining, but there are also quite a lot of scenes of people just pottering around on their own. No, I associate this with being lifelike. Some people associate it with just being tedious.
Just to finish this thought about how this film defies our expectations of what a horror film can or should be, I think we can agree. It's brightly lit. There's scary or unnerving scenes that occur during the light of day, and that it abandons the typical dark and shadowy visual template employed by many fright films. So you're kind of bringing horror into the light of day in a lot of scenes here.
I mean, I suppose the bar is kind of underlit, isn't it? It's sort of shadows and darkness, but there it's the bright underlighting on Joe Turkel. But I actually find one of the most terrifying moments in the film is the encounter with the previous caretaker in the toilets of the the Overlook.
Creepy.
And that's just strip lit, isn't it? It's this sort of red and white and inescapable light.
No, Kubrick is the master of that aesthetic.
Yeah, that's a case where you can really see how Kubrick's style of direction with actors works. Again, some people have reacted against it and feel it's so grotesque or over the top, but it's exactly how Dr. Strangelove or A Clockwork Orange are played.
Yeah, good points. What I admire, too, is that most of the violence in The Shining is suggested. Arguably the goriest and most graphically violent scene is where Jack kills Halloran with an axe. And we see bloody dead sisters on the floor. We see a tuxedoed man with a bloody split skull. We, of course, observe that elevator full of blood several times. But we don't witness what caused this bloodshed. And instead of relying on gore and body counts, The Shining opts for the psychological horror approach, often using frightening facial expressions like Danny's silent scream or Wendy's mortified countenance or Jack's devilish grin or Halloran's wide-eyed face of shock and the bathtub hag's cackling grin.
I think the equally terrifying are the blank expressions of some of the ghosts. Certainly Grady in the bathroom and Joe Turkel as Lloyd. What's scary about them is that they aren't pulling faces. They are mirrors, they are reflecting Jack in a kind of deferential quiet. It's not a term that they'd used then, but it's enabling. That sort of sense that the Overlook is enabling his craziness and his violence.
Interesting. Right. And then you think of the disconcerting sound design, which sometimes employs silence and quieter than expected moments. I mean, who would have thought the simple sound of a kid pedaling a tricycle could be so eerie?
Yeah.
The secret behind why The Shining, to me anyway, is so effective lies in its brooding, foreboding tonality. So this is a picture that continually layers on dread and frightening anticipation of things to come from the first frame to the last. I mean, starting right from the beginning with the creepy bird's eye shots tracking Torrance's car to the final revelatory photograph of Jack. Recall how Jack relays the cannibalism story. The hotel manager casually mentions the hotel being built on an Indian burial ground, mentioning a previous caretaker slaughtering his family. Then later you hear the radio reports on the missing Aspen woman. And then Jack recounts his nightmare to Wendy about murdering his family. So everything is just this build-up. Some bad shit's going to go down here, and we're just waiting for it to happen. But the truth is, the whole movie is that. You're constantly waiting for something bad to happen. So how do you believe The Shining was influential on cinema and pop culture or set trends?
It wasn't hugely influential immediately on horror because it came just after Halloween and Friday the 13th and Alien, which sort of set the tone for what horror was going to be doing in the 80s.
Good point.
All of those films, I mean, not only were they imitated over and over and over in the 80s, they're still being imitated now. And maybe even if you throw in The Exorcist, Night of the Living Dead, and Jaws, some of those films are 50 years old now, but every month there are films that are derivative of them coming out.
Sure.
The flow has not stopped in those genres. Whereas with The Shining, it's hard to pick up. You see specific bits and pieces. Things like the scary bouncing ball. I know that's in The House on Sorority Row. There are a few horror films with snowbound settings, and that inevitably evokes The Shining. And maybe it's one of those things where people just pick up on bits and pieces of it occasionally. It adds to the repertoire of horror. Because it's a haunted house story, and there have been loads of those, it would be hard to say that, I don't know, Paranormal Activity doesn't seem to be particularly influenced by The Shining. I suppose it might have influenced some of the subsequent films based on Stephen King novels, although because King wasn't keen on the film, subsequent filmmakers have tended to shy away from it as an influence. Although, of course, in the last couple of years, we've had both Dr. Sleep and Ready Player One, which have essentially revisited The Shining. So
no, it's pervasive in pop culture.
It's plainly embedded in the zeitgeist.
Absolutely.
Both those films assume that you've seen Kubrick's film and will pick up on references to it.
Yeah, I mean, you think of how The Simpsons, South Park, Family Guy, even Toy Story and Toy Story 3 have nods to The Shining in them.
Yeah.
And they're not overt in some cases as far as references, so it's kind of understood that people have seen The Shining. But in terms of a more direct influence, I was doing my research on this, and I didn't think about this, but I guess this makes sense. So instead of magnifying the trope of the creepy or possessed child, The Shining began a new trend, and this is according to Looper. Quote, it focused more on telling empowered tales of survival and redemption through the innocent perspective of the children themselves. In putting Danny Torrance in a position of power, the boy became the beacon of hope throughout the entire film, unquote. So as examples that came later, you think of A Nightmare on Elm Street and how the teenagers have some agency there. The Goonies, Stranger Things, It, and so many other works post-1980 featured this kind of empowered child-hero dynamic. And maybe a small point, but it's an interesting trend.
Yeah, that's certainly an argument. I can certainly think of a bunch of films that would fit into that. That said, I can think of films that predate The Shining that starts that trend.
Okay.
Yeah, probably Night of the Hunter is
That's a good point.
the Night of the Hunter, the Charles Lawton film from Davis Grubb's novel.
Right.
I know that's a particular favorite of Stephen King, so that may well have fed into the property that way.
But Kim, echoing what you said earlier, I think this is one of the earliest examples of horror coming from within the nuclear family, shining a spotlight on the real-life terror that can come from domestic abuse, alcoholism, madness, and depending on your reading of the movie, maybe even child sexual abuse if you're looking for that.
That's a kind of hot topic now. That seems to be, it's almost like adding something else. I think certainly child sexual abuse is say, inherent in The Innocents. Or in Repulsion. But I think, no, what The Shining is about is having an alcoholic dad, isn't it?
Sure.
And I wonder if, even outside genre, whether maybe one should look at films from about the same period, like Kramer versus Kramer, Shoot the Moon, these sort of intense, big domestic arguments, maybe even Manhattan, they're all breaking up marriages,
Yes.
An unmarried woman. That was a sort of 70s thing.
No, you're right.
You sort of get that again maybe in The Brood.
Yeah, but what about this lesson here that the real horror can be found in your own household with a beloved family member capable of tremendous violence and evil intent? Had this been explored a lot before The Shining in a horror movie?
Well, Psycho, I suppose. Yeah, there are plenty of films that deal with the scary father. And as I say, it is essentially the plot of the Amityville Horror. Even The Exorcist, although there, of course, it's the child who's scary. But the idea of horror in the family, I think it's sort of inherent in genre. I wonder if, again, in terms of what was going on in cinema at the time, it just occurs to me that one of the other biggest films of 1980 was about a father trying to murder his son, The Empire Strikes Back.
Right, I wouldn't have thought of that, but that's true.
A little later, there was The Stepfather.
That's right.
That's such an interesting and original work in itself. But it may well have been influenced, if not by The Shining, by sort of Stephen King's work in general.
Sure. And I was going to mention the Steadicam was introduced here.
It was one of the things at the time people remarked on. There was a kind of fascination with it. And it was something that gave the film a distinctive look.
No question.
That, again, was something you hadn't seen in movies. It seems strange, but innovation was kind of what you expected when you went and saw a Stanley Kubrick film. It's like all his films, the lighting in Barry Lyndon or the model effects in 2001, these are all things you'd never seen before. You get a sense that Kubrick is one of those filmmakers other filmmakers pay a lot of attention to, because they know that what he does, they're going to be doing themselves. I get the impression that everybody was ready. I mean, John Landis got the Steadicam from him to use in American Werewolf.
Right. Well, again, we see the traces there of a new trend, at least technologically, and the visuals that can be accomplished therein. So there's something to that, and I think the Shining needs to be credited a little bit there. But I know that earlier you said you don't buy too much into, let's not look too deeply into a horror movie for meaning, per se, but are there any themes or messages worth exploring in The Shining?
Oh, yeah, there are an enormous number. All the stuff about the nuclear family and scariness and how well-intentioned people can do terrible damage to their loved ones, which I suppose is a Stephen King theme. But there's also this theme of the bad place, of the haunted house, of the idea that a haunted house represents something. I mean, I think people have gone overboard with the whole notion of specific political or national meanings. But it's true, there is all this Native American imagery in it.
Yeah, you're talking about, for example, the genocide of the Native Americans or perhaps the
I
Holocaust
don't
and
think
things like
that's a particular theme of the film, but it's there. I think that's more to do with where the film is set.
Okay.
But it's inescapably a part of it. But that may well be, because if you're making a haunted house movie set in America, that's the only history you've got, apart from witch hanging. Witches weren't burned in America. Story set in Europe, you've got thousands of years of horrible injustices to wall up. Yeah,
No question.
And it's certainly true that I think The House of Usher is as much America as it is a psychological representation of Roderick Usher. And I think that that's built in. And another big American haunted house story, The House of Seven Gables, is explicitly rooted in the hypocrisies and crimes of the Salem witch trials. The idea that your haunted house is imbued with all the evils of your nation it's inherent in the genre.
To me, the biggest message or takeaway from the film could be just the most obvious, and that is breaking the cycle of abuse and violence. And we see how Jack, he can't escape. He becomes lost and trapped in a literal and figurative maze. But Wendy and Danny do survive. They get away. And you take out the supernatural elements, and this could easily be understood as a story about how personal demons and isolation, toxic masculinity, and misogyny can destroy a typical family.
But that's probably our first reading now, because we've had 40 years of discussion of this stuff, which wasn't particularly current at the time. I think it's something that is deeply felt in the film. I think it's different in the novel, but I think the film does some interesting things that aren't in the novel, particularly with regards to the characters of Wendy and Danny, who I think are, again, to go back to sort of spoilering, in the novel, essentially, Jack redeems himself and saves his family, but dies in the attempt. In the film, the wife and the child stand up for themselves. And I think that's why Halloran's killed as well. They're not rescued by somebody else. Yeah, the guy who travels cross-country to rescue them is killed. So Danny and Wendy have to rescue themselves.
Yes.
And I think that it's a more Kubrickian approach. I think King seems much more invested in Jack, whereas Kubrick seems more invested in the innocent victims, as it were, although I think he is very good on how Wendy and Danny kind of enable their father. This little speech that Shelley Duvall has, where she's talking to the social worker about how Danny's arm got broken, I think it's absolutely perfect. That's one of those things. I find that among the most terrifying moments in the film. Also, I have to say, as a writer, the scene where Wendy comes and tries to talk to Jack while he's trying to write, I absolutely recognize that, and I see how irritating that actually can be.
Sure. I mean, even writer's block can be a bit of a theme at work here.
Yeah.
What about the actual naming of the hotel as the Overlook? Now, it was called as such in King's novel, and he wasn't necessarily going for any kind of a subtextual theme about genocide or killing of Native Americans. But do you think there's something to this in terms of the actual name of the hotel?
I just assumed because it was on the top of a mountain.
Exactly.
It was a forgotten place or an overlooked place. I just thought that it was a sort of a relatively clever play on words. I don't necessarily think that that's what anyone was intending.
Sure.
But I certainly think that it's a story that has layers, doesn't it? It is about a labyrinth or a maze. So all those things are in it.
Speaking of, is there anything to the myth of the Minotaur? Now, this is something explored in that documentary. But if you know anything about the Minotaur, I'm sure you do. He lives in the center of a maze-like labyrinth, but he's later killed by an Athenian hero. So is there something to this? Do you read into that at all, as far as maybe Jack being the Minotaur?
It doesn't quite map on the myth, because Theseus is a bad guy. He defeats the Minotaur, but he betrays Ariadne. He's not a rescuer. And it's not about somebody standing up for themselves. It's about somebody coming in. Actually, in many ways, because the Minotaur is a son, isn't he? He's the sort of Mrs. Rochester character. He's the monster who's come from the ruling house and has been put away somewhere. No, I in that case, I think it was said that Kubrick thought the the topiary animals from the book would look silly on film.
Right, there's no CGI in 1980
And so
to make that
he
possible.
needed something else, and he went with a hedge maze.
Mm-hmm.
Thinking about it, he, like I, in fact, at that time lived quite near Hampton Court, which has probably the most famous hedge maze in Britain. So he may well have been thinking of that.
Interesting.
That's very near the place I saw the film as well.
Small world. How do you interpret the photograph at the conclusion that shows Jack alive in 1921? So there's a lot of theories about this, the most prevalent being, and I think Kubrick even kind of iterated this in an interview, that modern-day Jack is the reincarnation of an earlier Jack who ran the hotel decades earlier, and I guess that suggests that this soul is doomed to repeat a cycle of violence, and insinuating perhaps that this is a preordained fate. What do you think about this?
That wasn't my immediate reading of it. I mean, I was taking, in fact, basically the ending of Burnt Offerings, where appearing in a photograph is like there are ghost stories about being trapped in paintings as well. Mm-hmm. It's just a signifier that Jack is now one of the ghosts of the hotel.
He's absorbed, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I can buy into that as well. I mean, I don't think there's a wrong answer here, and it's kind of fun to parse it through, but it is a head-scratcher. The first time you walk out of The Shining or finish watching it, this is something that is often most talked about. What does that mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's to the movie's credit. It conjures up further conversation. So 40 years, it means a lot of candles, right? And if this were an actual birthday party, a lot of presents too. But I continue to argue with this podcast that it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So Kim, what is The Shining's greatest gift to viewers? I
suppose it's still a scary movie. And that may well be it. Yeah, there are bits of it that have entered into the consciousness, isn't there? There are the twins, and there's Here's Johnny, which was frightening even in Britain, and we didn't get Johnny Carson, so we had no idea what that meant. and maybe even things like Henry Hall, the music, all these things are now part of the furniture of horror, and certainly the blood coming out of the lift. Those things have just become part of our popular culture. They are things people refer to.
Yeah, all work and no play make Jack a dull boy.
I think that's how writers think that people they live with feel they passed their time.
Well, I can relate a little bit. My wife often raises an eyebrow when I'm in my office for too long, clicking away. Any other greatest gifts? It doesn't have to be one.
No, I'll go with that.
Okay. I would totally agree with everything you said, but I would also add that, in retrospect, after watching this movie, it's probably about 10, 11 times now over the years, I think the two greatest performances in the movie, they don't involve Jack Nicholson. I love Jack Nicholson. He's arguably my favorite actor. But you think about the turns by Danny Lloyd and Shelley Duvall, I think it's amazing.
I think it's one of the best performances by a child in a major motion picture.
He's only 7 years old, Kim. It's amazing.
Yeah.
It harkens back to Haley Joel Osment in The Sixth Sense, another fantastic child performance. But I don't know what it is about horror, but sometimes it brings out the best in kid actors or something. And Shelley Duvall, I think, has been woefully underappreciated all these years just for the kind of performance she's asked to give. And if you know anything about the way that Kubrick berated her, it's easy to feel sorry for her, but it just comes out on screen. She is just battered and traumatized and living frailly. No,
I think she's true. It's interesting because I've seen that weird documentary which shows her having a bad time on set. Mm-hmm. But Danny Lloyd doesn't seem to have had the same time. That's not how Kubrick directed him. I've known several people, over the years who've appeared in Stanley Kubrick films. I've met Gus Hasford, who wrote The Short Timers, which was Full Metal Jacket, and lots of other people, and they all had sort of horror stories, but they all kind of were like fanatically loyal to him as well.
Yeah, the prevailing story, at least that Duvall continues to tell, that I've read about, is that he particularly picked on her because I think he was trying to elicit a certain kind of performance. I don't think she was being a prima donna or anything like that, but in any event,
no, I don't think so
there.
either. She is remarkable in it. There is a sort of special circumstance for her, which is that the overwhelming bulk of her screen career before then was working for Robert Altman, who is a very different type of director. I've also met plenty of people who work for him, and they all loved him. But his mode of getting people to do things was very different from Stanley Kubrick's mode of getting people to do things. Now, I think you could say there are people who will read the way that Altman directed as equally but subtly abusive, in that he was manipulative and coaxing and seductive in a way that may have crossed some lines we don't really want to see crossed anymore.
Right.
Shelley Duvall responded brilliantly to that kind of action. I mean, she wasn't a trained actress, so she was actually she was a tour guide at the Astrodome
That's
when
right.
Altman was shooting Brewster McCloud there, and he just pulled her out and made her the lead in the film. She is one of the great film personalities of the 1970s. And it's not true that her career ended after The Shining either. She went into production and was very successful. So.
Yeah, she went right into Popeye, I think, with Robert Altman, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. And then Fairy Tale Theatre, which
Showtime
maybe
or
not
something,
remembered now, but was a very important show.
I remember that. Yeah, good point. So anyway, this long overlooked performance, I think, is being appreciated more today. So, Kim, what's the legacy of The Shining? Do you think this movie will still be widely watched and considered relevant in another 40 years?
That's a good point. I suspect so. I suspect it's reached that point where, I mean, if you consider the 80-year-old horror films that we're still interested in now, I think The Shining is up there with those.
It's in the pantheon, would you agree?
Yeah.
Now, I don't worry about it too much. Sometimes you have to worry about the longevity of some older films, but Jack Nicholson, Kubrick, it's a color film. It's continued to be watched. It has a relatively popular sequel. I think that it's in stone. It's not going anywhere.
Yeah.
So, Kim, are you currently working on anything that you'd like listeners to know about?
I've just started a novel, so that's not going to be around for maybe 2 years. I've got a novel out at the moment, which is called Anno Dracula 1999 Daikaiju.
Wow. And how many in the series now, Anno Dracula?
6 or 7 if you count the comic, which I do.
Fantastic.
The comic book, which is collected as Anno Dracula 7 Days in Mayhem. It was explicitly created to be a part of the series rather than an add-on.
Okay. How about any upcoming appearances on any streaming sites?
I'm locked
bonus
up like
features?
everybody else. Yeah, my diary is completely empty. I mean, I was down for a whole bunch of conventions and festivals and events this year, but I think that's all gone.
It's a strange time, but it's a good time to maybe catch up on some films and different things that you didn't have the time for before. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's true. I'm currently watching a lot of 1940s films, but yeah.
Good taste.
Yeah.
All right. Anything further to add or things you want to mention
Nope,
or
that's
endorse?
it. Hope this has all been of use.
Tremendously. It's such a personal thrill and treat to have been able to talk to you. And again, I couldn't think of a better guest for this particular installment. So, Kim, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to me for Cineversary and sharing in the 40th birthday of The Shining, one of our favorite horror films. Where does this rank for you? Can I ask you, do you rank this any particular slot?
Certainly it's in my top 10 horror films, yeah.
Fantastic. So still holds a very high place. As with me, it is in my top 10 as well. So, and we don't have to wait for Halloween to celebrate it. I mean, it was 40 years ago in May that it came out, so it's only fitting now. Well, Kim, thanks again for your generous time, and you have a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. Okay, bye.
Now that was a blast. My gratitude unbound to Kim Newman for taking time with me to explore The Shining. Yep, it's time again for your favorite monthly segment, Standing Ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, a podcast, or another work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. For June, I thought I'd point the way to several cool products tied to this month's movie that you can check out. So one is a throw blanket featuring the Overlook Hotel carpet pattern, no home complete without it, which you can pick up for under $40 at redbubble.com. Another product is a board game called The Shining, Escape from the Overlook Hotel. It's part of the Coded Chronicles board game series where, according to the manufacturer USAopoly, quote, you work to unlock clues and solve puzzles by using a unique code revealing mechanic. Each game offers a unique storyline and objective to provide a one-of-a-kind gameplay experience, unquote. So this game can be yours for $30 at theop.games if you're so minded. You can also pick up an 8-inch bobblehead replica of, the Creepy Grady twins, made by Forever Collectibles, for around $50 at Toynk Toys. The website is toynk.com. And lastly, you definitely want to pick up a newly restored copy of The Shining, available on 4K Ultra HD Blu-ray, standard Blu-ray, and digital HD, all in one package, currently priced around $20 or less. And no, I'm not shilling as a paid spokesperson for this stuff. This is simply cool merch that I found online that, yep, you might want to check out. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. That about does it. Another chapter of Cineversary in the books. Curious what we have cooked up for you in July? Well, we're going to send 70th birthday wishes to one of the most revered classics of the last 7 decades. It's All About Eve, directed by Joseph L. Mankiewicz. And I'm crossing my fingers that we'll have a special guest for next month, too, if the fates are kind to us. But even if they're not, it's okay. I'm sure it will be a fantastic installment with a wonderful guest, so I hope you can join us. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, stay safe and healthy throughout this pandemic, and cherish those classic movies because they're not getting older, they're getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.